Minister, recently we saw more protests to highlight the ongoing concerns that ordinary farmers have that they're going to have to pick up the tab for the failures of big agri-food corporations. So I'd like to ask you your views on the recently published Teagasc report on farm sustainability, which found that greenhouse gas emissions from dairy farming rose in 2020, largely due to an increase in the average herd size, and how you plan to address that, and if you make a statement on the matter.
Thank you, Deputy. The Climate Action Plan 2021 commits to reducing emissions from the agriculture sector to 16 to 18 megatons of CO2 by 2030, a 22 to 30% reduction from 2018 levels. This will be achieved by committing to a set of core measures which will deliver a minimum level of carbon emission reductions, and also by a set of further measures which will aim to go even further. My department has engaged proactively with the public, with stakeholders and with other government departments to deliver an ambitious, fair and achievable climate action plan. The core measures outlined in Climate Action Plan 2021 include efficiencies across the agriculture sector and also diversification measures, including increasing organic production and the production of biomethane. Further measures will be required to meet the targets set for this sector, and they include the introduction of a model for carbon farming, exploring feed-related methane reduction solutions and conducting a diversification review which will include an assessment on the wider production of biomethane. Combined, these measures will ensure that the agriculture sector meets its targets for 2030, while also setting pathways towards climate neutrality by 2050. The key metrics for the delivery of our climate ambition will be greenhouse gas emissions, farmers' incomes and other key environmental indicators. The measures set out in the Climate Action Plan will offer farmers ways to reduce carbon emissions at farm level by becoming more efficient, and will also offer opportunities for diversification. These are opportunities which will protect farmers' income and at the same time Ireland's reputation for producing high quality and sustainable produce.
Bríd Smith.
Yesterday in the Journal there was an article reporting from the Institute of Agricultural Trade and Policy, a non-profit organisation, which showed that the increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the beef and dairy sector expansion, which are quite shocking, were accounted for by two Irish companies, Larry Goodman's ABP Meats and Dawn Meats, to the tune of 7.5% of all European Union emissions. Now, I contend, and I would like you to address it, that the increase in the dairy herd is not sustainable. It's an intensity model that was adopted by the previous coalition that your party entered into with Fianna Fáil in the Pathways for Growth, and it amounted to what has become a message to the smaller farmers: get big or get out, and that is why they are continually protesting their plight. Now, we recently saw funding given to the tune of 70 million to the meat industry. Where is the money for the smaller farmers? Where is their just transition? Why do we keep pampering Larry Goodman and the meat industry?
So, Deputy, the goal of our agriculture emissions reduction policy, of our agriculture climate policy, is not to reduce the herd or to increase the herd or to stabilise the herd. The goal is to cut emissions, and at the same time the goal is to increase farm incomes. So those are the two things we're trying to do at the same time: cut emissions and increase income. Now, how we get there is another question. We don't have to say you must do it in this way, you must do it in that way. Methane is extremely damaging to the environment. And I think the IFA is now beginning to understand that this is a huge opportunity, that cuts to methane emissions, in fact, will be very beneficial to the climate, and that they have this opportunity that where methane is not being released, and there are many ways that have been discussed in the Teagasc report on how methane can be reduced, that whatever ways are chosen, that farmers, in fact, will be a huge part of the solution. Farming and agriculture is a different kind of sector from all the different sectors because they have the opportunity to sequester carbon. It doesn't exist, for example, in the transport sector or in the energy sector. They have the possibility to have negative emissions.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Deputy Smith.
Well, there's a shocking level of emissions from the agricultural sector, and I think that you've just talked yourself into saying that we can't do this because you say we mustn't do it, but we don't know how we're going to reduce the emissions. We can do it many ways, but we're not reducing the herd. And that's absolutely nonsense. There's been a policy in this state to increase the herd steadily since 2011 and to create export markets abroad where they never existed. And the entire policy is based on a food strategy that is unsustainable. And I think at some point this government is going to have to answer for that. Even the EPA has shown that the agricultural sector has accounted for 37% of greenhouse gas emissions last year in this country. Now, there is no way around that. You are going to have to do something about the size of the national herd and do something about the demands from the meat processing industry in particular. It is not the smaller family farms who are responsible for this. This is being driven by a food policy that is all about the exports from the meat industry.
Minister to conclude.
Deputy, the goal is to cut emissions and to increase farm incomes. I mean, that's what it is. And farmers may choose to reduce their herd if that is the best way for them to get there. Now, you referred to the Teagasc report, and what the Teagasc report says is that total farm greenhouse gas emissions in dairy increased in 2020, largely due to an increase in the average herd size. However, GHG emissions per hectare on dairy farms remained relatively stable as the average dairy farm area increased. The GHG emissions intensity of milk production, in other words, the CO2 per kilo of milk, improved. Effectively, this means that the average kilogram of milk was produced with a lower carbon footprint. However, this improvement in GHG emissions intensity was offset by a higher volume of milk produced on the back of a larger average herd size. So hence, farm-level GHG emissions increased on dairy farms in 2020. Whereas on non-dairy farms, farm-level GHG emissions on sheep and tillage farms remained stable in 2020. Farm-level emissions on cattle farms declined slightly per hectare emissions. Agricultural emissions are incredibly complex, and reducing them will never be found with a very simple solution. It's much more complex than the other sectors. You have emissions, and then you have removals going into soil, going into plants, and going into animals.
Moving on.